Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time Samuel sailed to America in order to evacuate Loyalists from New York to Nova Scotia after the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War. With both military and civilians on board, the ship landed at Nova Scotia, where land was being offered to anyone who wanted to stay. The weather was harsh and many of the shelters and homes were rudimentary, making for a tough time. Samuel's captain was eager to get back to Great Britain, but his hopes were quickly dashed as the ship was ordered to Florida. We find Samuel now sailing towards the southeast United States in December 1783. We sailed from Sandy Hook the 13th of December 1783 in company with the Spring, Juno, Bonita, and Sky's transports for St. Augustine, and soon after parted with all but the Spring. We experienced very turbulent weather during this passage to the southward. In one of the strong gales we perceived a meteor at the top of the mast, like a dull light in a lanthorn. Sometimes these meteors appear at all the mastheads and are seen at times running up by a rope till they arrive at the truck. Sailors, in general, call these lights corsants, which I imagine is a term used by popish seamen, and the meaning is that they suppose it to be the spirit or corpse of a saint. It is a received opinion that these lights appear at the height of the storm, and of course are not looked on as unwelcome visitants, though as sailors are generally superstitious, I never knew one hardy enough to go near it, and strange stories are reported concerning them. The Spring, having made a signal of distress, we bore down to her and found she had sprung her mainyard and rudder, which retarded our progress. We found our caps on the main and foremast heads to be in a shattered condition and immediately clapped on preventer ones by wooling rope below the originals. One day after a heavy gale, the Spring being too near to us, and it falling suddenly calm, our ship drifted and, being also attracted, we fell on board the Spring. The sea running very high at the time threw us all into great consternation, expecting the ships would dash each other to pieces. They appeared like wild bulls jumping and goring each other, tearing and breaking all before them. At length we passed a rope from the head of one ship to the stern of the other, and by pulling this rope one ship shot by the other, and a small breeze arising, they were kept from a repetition. These accidents frequently occur in fleets. On the 9th, we discovered St. Simona Head in Georgia, and the next morning found ourselves close in with St. Mary's Bar. Having now entered the river, we rounded the shoal point of Amelia Island and discovered a brig at anchor, which served as a guide for berthing our ship. We were informed that a king's schooner galley lay a little farther up the river, to whom we applied for advice, and our master found it requisite to go to St. Johnstown, on the river of that name, from which a communication was carried on with St. Augustine, the governor's residence. St. John's lay about 40 miles off, and the track was through marshes and drowned islands. The only inhabitants we found on Amelia Island were an old man and his daughter, who I believe subsisted chiefly on oysters which covered the banks of the rivers and creeks. I have heard that the raccoons are sometimes caught by the oysters that are fast to the bed, by thrusting in their paws in an open shell, which immediately closes on them. Our carpenter was now sent to cut down a large live oak of about 18 or 20 inches diameter for the purpose of making new caps for the lower masts, and these caps were boiled in the coppers to season them for the purpose. The carpenter, having learnt that there were some deer near us in a wood, he and the mate furnished themselves with muskets and ammunition, and in the evening landed in hopes to bring on board a deer by the morning. But, not being acquainted with the haunt of these animals, nor with a track in the woods, they got bewildered and returned to the ship at daybreak with part of the carpenter's jacket torn off by the gunpowder exploding in his pocket, and this sickened them of hunting in the future. I was given to understand that the method pursued by the native hunters to procure deer was as follows. After acquainting themselves with the deer haunts, they endeavored to get to the leeward of them in the night, and then kindle a fire with pitch pine or turpentine sticks, which was in general placed in a long-handled frying pan. This was carried on one of their shoulders, and the light attracted the attention of the deer, whose eyes, from the reflection, appeared like two stars, at which the hunters always aimed and killed the animal. A deer exclusive of its skin and head was to be purchased of the hunters for $1, or a pound of gunpowder, but the venison was far from being fat like the English, and the best method to dress it was in an iron pot on the fire with fat pork, like roasted meat. Indeed, this was far superior to roasting it, except it had been first larded. The tide now answering early, we procured a pilot for the inland navigation from the galley, and set out on our first visit to St. John's in our 4-oared boat, Captain L.T. of the Spring and our captain being with us. We got to the Narrows, a shoal creek, soon after daylight, and there being no room to row, we had to set, or push, our boat through with our oars, though this creek had been considerably widened by the crew of a king's galley that had some time before gone this way. Having got past this creek, we sometimes passed close to bushes, woods, reeds, and mud, and about midday arrived at Nassau Sound, an inlet from the sea, running between Amelia and Talbot Islands. On this latter island we landed to wait for the flood tide, and having dined on salted beef, close by an oyster bed, we rambled about on the sandy beach marked by the footsteps of wild horses. Our pilot informed us that these animals were numerous here. We had only discovered 2 or 3 huts hitherto, one of which was occupied by a robber and his family. About 2 o'clock we again pushed forward for Davis's Bluff, so called from a hunter and his wife residing there, and we arrived at the town about 8 or 9 at night. This day's work was one of the longest I had ever been in a boat, having been rowing from daylight to this time of night, with only a little respite at dinner, and had accomplished the distance of 40 miles, so reputed. Before this settlement we passed 2 king's galleys, the Viper and Enterprise. These vessels were rigged with lateen yards, similar to the row galleys in the Mediterranean. Having dispatched the business at St. John's, we proceeded to the entrance of the river and found it shallower than St. Mary's, it being also a barred channel. We reached Davis's Bluff by dark, and the shipmasters retired for the night into the small hut, leaving the crew to shift for themselves. After we had landed our stores and secured the boat, we collected some dry wood and kindled a fire near the border of a large forest, round which we lay down and slept, but not very soundly, as we were roused by hearing some animal eating our quarter's beef. In the morning, we proceeded to the ship. As our work was now laborious, our master allowed us a purser's pint of rum per day, divided in grog between us, amounting to about 1/4 of a pint of grog for each. What liberality! The bread, oatmeal, and flour we used was the condemned provisions, the former full of weevils, and the latter sour. About once a week we had either venison or fresh beef for dinner and supper, breakfast being a banyan meal. The beef was lean, as the cattle were wild and killed by shooting. From our ship I have seen the deer browsing in the marshes. Having hauled our ship to the beach, we gave her bottom a good cleaning, after which some of us were sent to cut wood and others to bring it on board, having a long distance to carry it on our shoulders through the marshes on broken reeds. Having neither shoes nor stockings, this galled my feet severely, as well as my shoulder, having nothing on it but a shirt or canvas frock. These marshes were swarming with mosquitoes and sandflies, which made many a good meal on my blood, and the latter used to come on board this ship in clouds about sunset, and their bite on hands and face was like the prick of a fine needle. We discovered some sassafras trees, the roots of which, with china root, we occasionally boiled for breakfast. The latter made the tea of a red color and was used by the natives. After laying here several weeks, a fleet of transports arrived from England for the evacuation. We were now ordered to prepare for loading ordnance stores. Accordingly, we got our water on deck and started it, in which I perceived fish alive that we must have taken out of the well at Staten Island some months before. On the first day of March, the surface of the river was almost covered with brown worms, very lively in their motions. Many of them took possession of the wood sheathing on our bottom and ate it to a honeycomb. Our master now, under a pretense of dunnaging the ship to keep the guns high in the hold, made us work hard in the woods in cutting, splitting, and carrying through a marsh about 40 dozen, I believe, of rough hickory handpikes. These he doubtless expected to make a good sale of in England, but alas, being ignorant of the season for cutting the wood, it was hewn in the spring when full of sap. They were therefore rotten long before we got to Great Britain. We also procured a large quantity of oak for firewood. This being a hot country bordering on the torrid zone, and by my wearing a Highland bonnet, my face was much exposed to the rays of the sun, which made it turn nearly the color of an Indian. The sandy paths on shore were sometimes as hot as to hurt the bottoms of my feet, and they were often wounded by landing on oyster beds, especially on the Tiger Island side of the harbor, which island was skirted with mud and oysters, and near which was a sandbank where we used to haul for fish with a borrowed net, and could half fill the boat in 2 or 3 hours with the following fish, viz. Drum, trout, mullet, whiting, shrimps, stingrays, skate, sheepshead, bonefish, pearlfish, catfish, and many others unknown by name. Once only we caught 2 fish of the torpedo species at the same haul. One was larger than the other, nearly 15 inches long, and of the shape of a turbot. They had dark brown circles on their backs, about an inch in diameter. When they were thrown out of the net, one of our crew took hold of one of them and received such a shock as to fling away the fish. This stroke, he imagined, had been given him by a man near him, which caused him to abuse his neighbor with threats to the admonishment of his shipmate, who had not touched him. Another person tried the fish and also received a lighter stroke, which became weaker from the torpedo as it expired. We carried them on board, but were afraid to eat them. This province, being now in an unsettled state, encouraged a number of poor hunters to rob and plunder the emigrants of their horses and negroes, which were sold to the Spaniards in West Florida. These banditti associated in gangs of 20 or 30 and were become formidable. A man named MacGirt was at the head of one company and lived a few miles from hence. One day, advice was received that a number of boats laden with plunder were expected down the river on their way to Georgia during the ensuing night, and as there was a navigable creek for them to turn off without coming near the galleys, it was thought advisable to waylay them. Accordingly, 2 boats were ordered to be got ready with 5 men in each, armed, including myself. Being provided with muskets, pistols, and cutlasses, we set out at dark for the creek, a few miles up the river, and on arrival placed our boats close under the point of the creek marsh. Here we lay still and quiet, and every noise we heard from alligators, which abounded in this river, or from fish leaping, made us look about. Our only chance, humanly speaking, for gaining a victory was by surprise, the robbers being all excellent marksmen, and their lives being at stake if taken. They would probably have fought hard, and likely overpower us by numbers. I sometimes got a nod or two while sitting on the thwart of the boat, surrounded with clouds of sandflies, and was not a little pleased to return to the viper in whole skin. In this country the hunters build their huts near a live oak tree, which not only casts a great shade, but is an indication of a spring or water. These men are lightly clothed with a large piece of coarse blue cloth wrapped round each leg, instead of stockings. Their shoes were made from a new hide in one piece, laced up before, which when dry is very hard, and these are called moccasins. They are generally seen armed with their rifle gun. It was our custom for one man to be always on the watch on deck during the night, at which time one of the apprentices again ran from the ship. He took with him whatever he thought useful, without any regard to the owners, and also the beef watering for the next day's boiling. On gaining the shore, he stole a canoe, being a noted thief and formerly a collier in the county of Durham. Our master thought it useless to go after him, and he had taken a route unknown to us, but suppose he went toward Savannah in Georgia. We obtained a Negro named York in his place. This man was sent to build a hut for his residence in a clear spot in the wood. He also built huts for keeping fowls and hogs during the night. To this place several captains sent their stock to feed during the day, and at night the poultry were penned up by York in their huts. But notwithstanding this precaution, the tiger cats, or some other animals, found means to steal away the fowls. 2 small hogs were kept on board on the lower deck, one of which, having got on top of a tub of pitch, sunk down into it, except his head. And as he was dead, our cook had orders to clean him, and it was roasted to regale some of our master's friends at dinner. A large quantity of frogs lived here in the marshes, and made a great noise when rain was coming on. Here our second mate went on board the Love transport on some business, and whilst in the cabin, a huge bear fixed his claws in the back of his jacket and gave it a huge rent, to the great astonishment of the Caledonian. The shipping at St. Mary's had now drawn a number of settlers to the beach to accommodate the sailors with grog, clothes, etc. One of these grog sellers, being in want of rum, had dispatched 2 Negroes in a canoe to St. John's for that article. But as they were going through the Narrows, 2 robbers came to them, and ordered the slaves to land and follow, which they did, taking a bottle of oil from the canoe. In the course of their route on Amelia Island, they came to a creek, and one of the robbers entered the creek to see if it was fordable. Before this man had reached the opposite side, the other robber's back being towards the Negro with the oil, he aimed a blow with a bottle at his head and brought him to the ground, having given him his death wound, seized on his rifle, and on firing at the other in the water, wounded him so that he could scarcely crawl up the bank, but he got away. The Negroes, not being desirous to stay in such a dangerous vicinity, stripped the dead, cut off a scalp from his head, and returned to their master. I saw the Negroes on the borders of the wood with a hunter's gun, pouch, etc., and they informed me of the catastrophe and handed me the scalp, the hair on which was red or carroty and appeared inclined to curl. One of our crew had visited a hut near the place where the man was killed, and on going a little way into the wood, discovered a vast quantity of goods hid amongst the bushes, doubtless the plunder of many houses. Another man from our ship had been on an expedition in quest of McGirt's company, and had visited his hut where they found Mrs. McGirt, but could not find the captain. The day after the robber was killed, a party was dispatched to bury him. Amongst the rest was a Negro belonging to an emigrant family residing in our ship, and having executed their work, on his return brought with him some young raccoons that he had found. These he gave to his wife, then suckling her child, who permitted the animals to draw her breast also, which coming to Captain A's knowledge, he flew into a violent rage with the woman, who was obliged to part with her additional nursery. The captain, that great Hector, took the two small boys with him one day into the woods, he having a musket in his hands, and as they were passing through some breaks, they heard the noise of tiger cats or some other animals fighting, and instead of guarding the boys from harm, he left the gun with them and ran off as fast as if a gang of robbers had been on his heels. We obtained a wild turkey here which weighed 14 pounds. It was shot by a native who had the art of calling them down by imitating their cry. About this time, the Spanish fleet had arrived at Augustine to take possession of the province, and having landed their troops and stores, appeared off St. Mary's Bar. The transports boats were sent by the agent to their assistance, and we piloted about 12 ships into safety, for which we received a gratuity. I was on board the Commodore, a king's brig, the crew of which were filthy in the extreme. Some little time after their arrival, an affray took place at some of the grog shops on the beach between the seamen of both nations, which ended in the death of a Spaniard. To prevent disputes in the future, a creek was made with a line of division to part the subjects of both nations when on shore, and this boundary cut us off from our well, our hickory wood, and our wild herbs. The Spanish fleet was now moored above the creek in the main river, and our ships collected towards the entrance. Sometimes we had to pass the Spaniards in taking our ladies in excursion, at which time they used to abuse us and insult the women with obscene language. Many of the men died here with a contagious disease, whilst the English remained free from it. One of my acquaintances dropped down dead suddenly, which was attributed to a stroke of the sun. This climate was subject to violent storms of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning, and its dreadful effects were to be seen on the trees in the woods and being shattered to pieces. This place was famous for watermelons, pumpkins, apricots, and plums. I was one day eating a piece of roasted pumpkin, very hot, when a wanton chap dashed it against my face, part of which flew up my nostrils and scalded them severely. I had often heard of a bird in Virginia that used to cry whippoorwill in the night, but here a bird of the same description used to cry Jack Will's widow. Great numbers of these in fine nights used to repeat this sound all night long. Here were red humming and nonpareil birds, also a variety of berries such as mulberries, blackberries, huckleberries, etc. A great variety of pines grew in this vicinity, fit for lower or smaller masts and yards, and these forests were free in a great measure from underwood, which made them appear from their arched heads both grand and gloomy. I was informed some wolves ranged through these vast woods, but never saw any. On one of the transport's boats returning down the river, the crew were alarmed by a continued noise under the boat's bottom, which was occasioned by the thrumming noise of a drumfish, which they had no knowledge of. These fish I have heard when in the ship's hold. I have also heard the augurs at work on a multitude of worms, like carpenters boring, and before we sailed, our sheathing was coming off in flakes, being an entire honeycomb. The ship having now her ordnance stores on board, and having also taken on board the scantling and boards of a house, for Mr. ATBS, our old gentleman passenger, we prepared for sea. The 28th of August, 1784, we sailed from St. Mary's River for New Providence. We had lain before Amelia Island 33 weeks, long enough to have made 4 voyages to the Bahamas. Our bottom was now so ragged and foul that we could make but little progress in sailing, and the wind generally blew from the southeast, so that we were just a month on our passage. We arrived at Nassau in New Providence about the 25th of September, and moored our ship opposite the custom house for another long sleep. This harbor was about 150 fathoms wide, and about 3 miles in length, with a ridge of sand running lengthwise, in the middle on which was shoal water. The harbor was formed by Hog and Providence Islands, and was a snug harbor. The governor's house was on a round hill just at the back of the town, and very pleasantly situated. The water was so clear in the harbor that when calm in the morning, a shilling could be seen at the bottom, and all fish that were of good size might be discovered. I have also seen a green turtle swimming here. Here, instead of having fresh beef, our crew had green turtle once a week, out of which the family on board selected what they wanted, and I was often employed by them in chopping the lean of the turtle with fat pork ready for the ladies to make up in the forcemeat balls. For some months I was the running footman to this family, and as the daughters made up shirts and gowns for people, I had many a jaunt to the stores for cloth, silks, thread, etc., and to carry home the work, and being barefooted, my heels were often bruised and the feet injured on sharp rocks and small stones through the streets of Nassau. I had to fetch almost daily milk and bread from the shop of Mr. Room, and to fetch water from a well in the bushes much frequented by the most elegant green and gold hummingbirds. The tropical fruits were to be had here in great plenty, though very dear. A great variety of fish were to be caught with hook and line, but many of those were of a poisonous quality. The margaret fish, about the size of an English bream, was most in esteem and often stewed for soup. I have seen here green fish with beaks like parrots and their eyes red. This place is noted for black men diving for conchs and other things. At the entrance of the harbor on Hog Island was a Negro hung on an oblique pole for murder, and his legs were near the ground. The waves in blowing weather used to wash him to and fro on the rocky point. This place was noted for small, fast-sailing schooners, employed in the trade to the Spanish Main, and some of these returned with green turtle, some of which, on landing, were so emaciated by being kept many weeks out of the water in these vessels that I have seen holes in the joints of the shell arising from poverty. On the arrival of the turtle they are deposited in the wharves built on purpose to receive them, and being fed in these wells, and having plenty of pure salt water to range in, they soon recover their flesh. When one is to be killed, a man descends through a trap hatch, and having selected the size wanted, it is drawn up by a rope and sold to any comer at 6d. per pound. Other schooners are cruising amongst the labyrinth of keys, shoals, and islands in hopes of discovering vessels wrecked in this vicinity, or in the Gulf of Florida. But whether the crew of these craft are descendants of the pirates that formerly frequented the island of Providence, I know not. But I believe many of them are not more honest, and I have been informed that instead of warning ships when they have been in danger, they have frequently misled them by going through difficult channels or showing lights to make them alter their course and run on shore. The principal well for watering shipping here, 'tis said, was dug by order of a pirate, known by the name of Blackbeard, but the water is very brackish, being near the sea and amongst the rocks. The shore at low water, where it is sandy, is inhabited by a numerous quantity of small black crabs, with one large claw besides the small ones. A large flatfish was seen in the harbor while we lay here, which was supposed to be the devilfish, having 2 horns, and I was informed that one of these, at Charleston, had run away with a small schooner by means of its horns. Whilst we lay at Nassau, the election of the House of Assembly took place, through the Bahama Islands, and great rancor was manifested between the contending parties, viz. The old inhabitants, which were termed conchs, and the new settlers termed refugees. Andros Island, not being yet inhabited, was to return 2 members. Both parties resorted to it for temporary residence before the election, and on their return, a refugee in the boat with me threw something at the head of a conch in another boat, which brought the crews into great danger from the violence of the contending parties. Whilst at Nassau, a ship's boat was appointed to run against a shore boat for a wager, and our captain was solicited for a crew to row the former, which gained the victory. The Nassau boat was rowed by people belonging to the island craft, and which are generally termed wreckers by the sailors, their business being to hunt for wrecks in the Gulf of Florida, especially on the Martyrs Reef near the peninsula. One of the officers of a regiment in garrison here purchased a native boat in which he took great delight by sailing about the harbor, but not being a proficient in the management, she overset and sank, having iron shot for ballast, but his life was saved. In the street one day I discovered 2 live guanas on sale, about 8 or 10 pounds weight each. They appeared of the lizard species, their color black and their skin soft. Their mouths were sewn up to prevent their biting, and I was informed were eaten stewed and counted excellent food, but their appearance was certainly disgusting. After being in this harbor some months, we landed the ordnance stores at the fort, and after there had been a grand ball one evening on our quarterdeck, with violins and French horns, to accommodate the company from the town, the agent shifted his pennant to the Hope powder ship, laying above the town. We now began to prepare for heaving down our ship to get her new sheathed, the worms having nearly destroyed the old. Mr. Russell, the shipbuilder at St. John's, had brought his property here in the live oak brig that he had built there, and finding a proper careening place at Hog Island, had now established a shipyard there. To this place we hauled our ship, and there being an old store there, we began removing our ship's stores into it. I used to be locked in this place at night as a guard. I hung my hammock to the rafter beams very high, and had to place casks on each other to get to my bed in the dark. The rats made a sad noise in the night which often disturbed my rest. The floor of this place was dirty and dusty, and was also swarming with weevils and chigos, which paraded over me during the night, and many a chigo burrowed in my flesh. These insects are brown like a flea, but nearly the size of a mite. They make their passage through the skin, and there lay their eggs in a bag about the size of a pea. They are discovered by the part itching, and on inspection a small brown spot is discovered with transparent circle around it, which is the extremity of the bag of nits. Great care is required to extract the whole of this bag by breaking the skin round the circle with a fine needle, and then lifting out the bag. But it is in general broken, and of course some of the nits remain to destroy, which sailors fill the holes with snuff, turpentine, pepper, or some other strong ingredient. As I had neither shoes nor hose, my toes were often tied up with turpentine whilst we remained here, and were very sore. I have gone into this store in the daytime for an article, and on my return have washed the dust off my feet, at the same time discovering that several chigos were in this short space sticking to my feet and legs like the ticks found in the grass in England. Our ship being stripped, and the mainmast being well secured by outriggers, whilst the carpenter was caulking the topsides, we began to heave her keel out, but the water found means to increase in the hold all day long, notwithstanding we were constantly at the pump. Mr. A, now intending to give a root in his newly erected dwelling, I was dispatched in the morning from the careening place to procure the requisite refreshments. The domestics of this house were 2 old negroes. The man had a wooden leg, and the woman was gray-headed with age, almost in her dotage. When the air was cool, she made her appearance in a green blanket, which had a slit about the middle for her head to appear through, and this was then her cloak or mantle. These negroes, being infirm and stupid, I often had to officiate in various departments in this day's attendance, and then, when dismissed, to return to Hog Island to be locked in the store for a few hours' rest. Whilst the agent belonged to our ship, we had to keep a black bear on board belonging to him. This animal used to go aloft and was often surly and troublesome. Sometimes, when thirsty, he would open the door under the dripstone to get at the water, and he and I had often disputes before I could get him to retire. He would grumble, scratch, and bite, and I had to flog him well with a rope to make him quit his hold. Our ship being now new sheathed, we moved the ship before the town of Nassau to prepare for sea. The inhabitants of Nassau were dissipated in the extreme, and from night revels many had injured their health. I saw little appearance of any religion, but heard that a man of color frequently preached to the eastward of the town, under a large spreading tree. If you've enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly, please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description to see how you can support this project and others, and tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.